This is Booked on Rock. I'm Rick Senich. Our guest is Steve Pilkington, author of Led Zeppelin, Every Album, Every Song. Think about Led Zeppelin, and the image coming to mind would be of them straddling the world as the archetypal rock gods, defining the 1970s like no other artist did. Dig deeper, though, and there's a lot more to Zeppelin than hard rock and bluster, with folk and blues strongly threading through their catalog from the very beginning. Led Zeppelin, Every Album, Every Song digs into every Led Zeppelin track recorded during their decade-long existence before John Bonham's death brought down the curtain, by way of facts, anecdotes, analysis, and a small dose of humor here and there. From the likes of Kashmir, Stairway to Heaven, and Whole Lotta Love and their ilk, which have entered the public consciousness, down to the deeper cuts, which only the fans will know, this book covers them all, while also taking a look into the stories behind the often groundbreaking cover art and the way the albums came to be recorded. Celebrating the triumphs and arguable lower points, this is an alternative history of the band, told via the most important element, the music itself, which has influenced so many down the years. The history of Led Zeppelin is a wild ride. This book shows you why. Steve Pilkington is a music journalist, editor, and broadcaster. He was the editor-in-chief for the Rock Society, published by Classic Rock Society magazine, and is now co-administrator of the rock website Velvet Thunder, as well as presenting a weekly internet radio show called A Saucer Full of Prague. Before taking on this work full-time, he spent years writing for fanzines and internet music review sites on a part-time basis. He's recently published books on Deep Purple and Rainbow, the Rolling Stones, and Iron Maiden, all for Sonic Bond Publishing. He's also written the official biography of legendary guitarist Gordon Giltrap. To hear a playlist of the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Steve, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Always good to talk about Led Zeppelin. Always welcome on this podcast for sure. And you wrote a book covering the entire Led Zeppelin catalog. Before we get to the music, let's first start with what you write in your introduction, which is about how the image of Led Zeppelin in the minds of the average music fan is much simpler than what this band is really about. Much has been made of the rock god's image and the private jets and dabbling in the occult. Those who have followed this band over the years know, though, that the music is what made this band so important, more than anything else.
Absolutely. I mean, to the average sort of non-Zeppelin fan who knows a little bit about rock and that kind of thing, they will obviously just think Zeppelin, typical hard rock band from the 70s and all the excess, Robert Plant, the Golden God image, Jimmy Page with his Les Paul and all that kind of thing, the Starship, the plane that they had that used to fly around them. All of those things, I think, are embedded in the public consciousness, and rightly so in a way, because I think it's fair to say that Zeppelin embodied the image of the 70s more than any other band. You think of the 70s, you think of Zeppelin. But if you look into the band's music, there's so much more to it than that. I mean, I can't think of many bands who have covered so many different bases over the whole catalogue, if you like, without really being recognised for it. You know, the folk stuff, the bluesy stuff, country stuff. I mean, there's the ill-advised reggae thing. There's even a little bit of samba there. All sorts of things. They would experiment, they would do it, and they were good enough to do it. But people still think, oh, Zeppelin, oh yeah, the heavy rock Led Zeppelin, yeah, that, or they might think of Stairway to Heaven, but people don't think beyond that. But there was so much depth to Zeppelin, which people accept with bands like Pink Floyd and that. Nobody would say, oh yeah, Pink Floyd, they were a psychedelic band. They see Emily play and that was it. Nobody does that. But Zeppelin, even though there's as much, if not more, depth and variety to the catalogue, aren't really perceived that way.
And no band is more adventurous or was more adventurous than Led Zeppelin. And that adventure begins in 1968, fall of 68. Led Zeppelin enters Olympic Studios in London to record their debut album, which was released in January of 69. Let's talk about that album cover first before we get to the songs. Designed by George Hardy, who went on to work with the legendary British design firm Hipgnosis, which you just mentioned, Pink Floyd. They did those covers, Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here. This is a blunt evocation of the band's name, and this was Jimmy Page's choice, right?
It was, yeah. Page selected that photograph, which was taken by a photographer called Sam Shear. It was a photograph of the Hindenburg disaster. I mean, it's a photograph that a lot of people have seen, really, where like the back end of the Zeppelin is going down, and it's going down in flames. But the way they had it treated, and this is where George Hardy came in, is that rather than just put the photograph on the cover, George Hardy took the photograph and he treated it using mezzotint, which was an archaic printing technique going back, it was popular in the 19th century, but rarely used by that time. And that's what gives it that pointillist kind of effect, if you like, rather than being a vivid photograph. It's more impressionist, if you like, the way the photo is treated. And I think that makes it more interesting. I don't think it's a great cover, to be honest. I think it's a little bit too on the nose for me. It's a little bit obvious, maybe. But I suppose in a way it had to be, because they wanted to make a statement, and it did that. I think what is also interesting about that cover is the fact that when Page was first forming the new Yardbirds, originally Chris Drazier, who was playing bass with the Yardbirds at the time, was going to go with him, and he was going to basically be the bassist for Led Zeppelin. But before Zeppelin fully formed, or the new Yardbirds as they were fully formed, he decided he was going to hang up his bass and basically become a rock photographer, which I described in the book, I think, as effectively running away from the circus. Because he said, right, that's it, I'm going to be a photographer. And he ended up taking the photograph, which was used on the back cover of the album, which he was paid 21 guineas for that. And really, that's a massive come down from what he would have had if he decided to stay.
Well, that self-titled debut, 9 tracks, Good Times, Bad Times, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, You Shook Me, Dazed and Confused, Your Time Is Gonna Come, Black Mountainside, Communication Breakdown, I Can't Quit You Baby, and How Many More Times. That is as good as it gets. And the opening track, Good Times, Bad Times, the highlight of this song, you say, is John Bonham. There's a great story here regarding the Vanilla Fudge song, Ticket to Ride, and something their drummer Carmine Appice did.
Oh, yeah, it's fantastic, that, because basically there's, throughout that song, if you listen, and I think there's one example about 30 seconds in it, Bonham plays some amazing triplets on his bass drum so fast. And he got that from the playing on Ticket to Ride, the Vanilla Fudge track. And he was listening to that, he thought, oh, that sounds good, I'll do that. But what he didn't realise until later was that on the Vanilla Fudge recording, that was done using a double bass drum and the drumsticks as well. He assumed it was just the bass drum, so basically he just went and did it with this lightning foot and basically did something that was seemingly impossible. But he heard it in that way and just did it. It was amazing. He thought he was just emulating what Carmine Appice had done. Oh, great drum, he's done this, I'll do the same. But in actual fact, he was just inventing something amazing.
That's so cool. Dazed and Confused would be one of Led Zeppelin's most iconic songs, a song that would stretch out into a half hour, maybe more in concert at times. Communication Breakdown, you write that this could be described as a prototype speed metal track, and it also inspired the most iconic punk band of all time.
Yeah, well, what it is, the way that Page played that riff, it was unusual for him because it was very fast downstrokes with his picking, which didn't come naturally to him. And he did say that he didn't really enjoy playing that way, and he found it quite difficult. But it was that really fast downstrokes like that was something that hadn't really been heard much. And it's definitely a recorded thing that Johnny Ramone was so taken with the way he played that riff that basically he took that picking technique and just ran with it and more or less made it his own. I mean, the whole Ramones guitar style is based on that picking rhythm, and that stems directly from Communication Breakdown.
A lot of bands have that sophomore slump, and they have that great debut album, and then the second one comes out, not so much. Not the case with Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin 2, released in October of 1969, and here's the track listing for Zeppelin 2. Whole Lot of Love, What Is and What Should Never Be, The Lemon Song, Thank You, Heartbreaker, Into Living Loving Maid, She's Just a Woman, Ramble On, Moby Dick, and Bring It On Home. Whole Lot of Love, it's up there with Stairway to Heaven as far as radio airplay. Talk about the origins of this song, Whole Lot of Love. The iconic riff, Robert Plant's insane vocals, which is done in one take. Amazing.
It was. Absolutely, yeah. But it was one of the tracks that they were accused of ripping it off the old bluesmen. There's all sorts of that stuff on the first album. And In this particular case, he had to give a credit to Willie Dixon for his song You Need Love. But in actual fact, that's a little bit, I think, a little bit disingenuous, because if you listen to that original song by him, there's, beyond the title and the way it's referenced in the lyrics, there's not that much of a similarity to me. It's actually more similar to a song by the Small Faces. I think it was called You Need Loving, something like that. It bears more of a resemblance to that, I think. But basically, with Whole Lot of Love, it's the riff, isn't it? I mean, that's what it's all about. It's one of the most iconic riffs. If you listen to it, it does bear a fair amount of similarity to a little bit in Hendrix's version of Hey Joe. Because where you got after where you go with that gun in your hand, you got da-dum, da-dum, dum, 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 that little bass riff in there. And that's da-do, da-do, da. It's quite similar, but it's the way that Page plays it and the sheer power that he gets into it is basically, it just blows that out of the water. It doesn't matter what the notes are, it's just the sound of it. And I believe that was where Page was using his Les Paul by this time, because he used a Telecaster on the first album. And the difference in sound is absolutely immense. He actually got his first Les Paul, which he used on that track, from Joe Walsh, as a matter of fact.
Is the criticism that Led Zeppelin had received over the years regarding these blues songs and a lot of the legal battles they got into about making sure that they credit the proper artist, fair or unfair?
I think it's the truth lies somewhere in the middle. In some cases, it was very much unfair. Like, for example, with Bring It On Home, where they had to give credit for that to the parts of the song that are used just at the start and the end of it, which was basically a tribute. Sandwiched in the middle is what for me is the meat of the track, which is entirely different. And they were accused of ripping that off, but I don't think that's the case. With Whole Lot of Love, I don't think it was really ripped off that much. But there were other cases where very much so, very bit naughty, really. I mean, a perfect example is Dazed and Confused, where that song was written by Jake Holmes. And you find it on his album, which is called The Underground Sound of Jake Holmes. And it's the same song. The lyrics are a little different, but it's essentially just the same song. Page actually went on to deny he'd heard it. But when in actual fact, the album was in his collection, and also Jake Holmes supported the Yardbirds. So and he played that song, and Page was watching him from the wings. So I think, okay, Zeppelin made it into very much of a different song, but remember, Page played it with the Yardbirds first. He started playing it with the Yardbirds just after he got the album and Jake Holmes had supported them. And it got changed legally later to Inspired by Jake Holmes, I believe. But to my mind, that should always have been a co-writing credit, certainly.
And I think maybe where all of this comes from is when they're not crediting the artist at all, that's going to rub people the wrong way.
Yeah, that's right. And the times when, they did that, there were times when they didn't. And I don't think it's as much blind thievery as sometimes people would like to say. But sometimes Page didn't help himself, let's say that. If he hadn't been a bit naughty with his credits on certain occasions, maybe other times when he didn't deserve it, he wouldn't have got the stick that he did. So he made his own bed in a little way like that.
One thing before we move on to another track from Zeppelin 2, I want to talk about the midsection of Whole Lot of Love. I still remember being a kid, putting this record on the turntable. My older brother had it, listening with headphones, and it just blew my mind. Talk about the part that specifically there's a mistake in there that is turned into one of the coolest effects in rock history. And this is thanks to Jimmy Page and producer Eddie Kramer's creativity.
It certainly is, because that's towards the end of that section where it's about to come back in, the riff, and there's a bit where Robert Plant comes in from the sonic soup, if you like. His voice comes up with that, woman, you need. You can hear in that bit, before he sings each word there's an echo of his voice, a pre-echo before it that you can hear. And what that was a bleed through from a previous take. And they couldn't manage to erase it from the tape. So rather than just leave it there so people would notice it, what Page said was, right, okay, let's just drench that in reverb, make a feature of it, and make out like it was always meant to be there. And the history's made.
That's old school right there. That's not going to happen anymore with all the technology today.
No.
Thank you. That track is believed to be the first Zeppelin lyric written by Robert Plant. A tribute to his wife, Maureen, could have some lyrics inspired by Jimi Hendrix.
Well, that's right. I mean, the Hendrix connections, but you got the lines like, if the sun refused to shine and the mountains crumble to the sea. That's, if you think of the Hendrix song, If 6 Was 9, there's very similar lines in there. I mean, I can't say for certain with that because Plant, to my knowledge, has never actually commented on that. But certainly, it's a track that everybody was listening to at the time. It was all over the place. Electric Ladyland was such a big thing. It's not beyond the realms of possibility, I think, that maybe that was inspired by it. But it's only, I mean, not a steal or anything. It's just a little...
We're not going to jump on them for this one.
No, certainly not. No credit to Hendrix. No. But generally, it's widely believed to be the first lyric that he wrote for Zeppelin. It depends on whether he actually had any significant writing contribution to the first album, because he wasn't credited for contractual reasons. Page was writing the majority of the lyrics, certainly. It's possible that Plant may have contributed some, but on the original credits, he wasn't allowed to be credited. So, but Thank You was, I believe, the first lyric he wrote for Zepp 2. And if he didn't have any significant contribution to the first album, yes, it's his first lyric. And it is directly dedicated to his wife. Yeah, absolutely.
Ramble On, another classic. Surprisingly, a song the band never played live. They did play it at the 07 reunion, and it was part of the Page Plant set list in the mid-90s, but that original lineup never played Ramble On. This is also notable for being the introduction of Robert Plant's Lord of the Rings influence.
Yeah, well, I think that particular Lord of the Rings influence I think that's quite fascinating because, I mean, obviously the verse in question, it's a clumsy verse because it comes up, like the song as a whole, he's talking about how, you know, he's been in the same place 10 years, his wanderlust is overtaking him and he's got to be rambling. I mean, that's old hat stuff, really. But then all of a sudden he comes in with this, is in the darkest depths of Mordor, I met a girl so fair, but Gollum and the evil one crept up and slipped away with her. Now, I mean, I like to put in the book, first of all, it's not clear how Robert Plant happened to be wandering through Mordor in the first place, and why any girl, fur or otherwise, would happen to be hanging around there as well. You know, hi, what are you doing in a place like this? You know, it seems a bit unusual. And then for Gollum and Sauron to pop up and decide to slip away with her is, well, it does make you wonder what he was smoking at the time. But it has led people to make all sorts of theories about it, like, is the whole lyric an allegory of the ring? Is the girl an allegory of the ring itself? I would say no, because the ring was taken to Mordor and destroyed. It wasn't found there, you know, so that doesn't really fit. So I don't buy the theory that the whole thing is a Tolkien thing. I think you just put that in and it's a clumsy verse. But then again, it's 50 years on and people are still talking about that lyric. So, you know, who's laughing? You know, it did its job, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Musically, it's a great song. The percussion in the verses, the big chorus. Again, this is something that Zeppelin don't get credit for. So early in their career, they were doing something that was so out of what people perceived the comfort zone to be. Who would have thought that they would do something like Ramble On after the first album?
Leads to the question, why was it never played live with that original lineup? That's a head scratcher.
It is, but there's quite a few songs over Zeppelin's career that were never played live. I suppose later on you can understand it more because by the time you get to Physical Graffiti and Presence and that, they've got so much behind them. And also when you're filling up your set with half an hour of Dazed and Confused and 20 minutes of No Quarter, you've not got much time to play with. So I suppose it's more understandable things didn't get played later on. But at that time, you're right, because you'd have thought they would have been playing most of those first two albums live. So it is a bit of an unusual one.
Before we move on to Zeppelin 3, we should mention the album cover on Zeppelin 2, because this is an interesting one, too. What do we see on this?
The picture on the front, it's a photograph of the original German pilots from Manfred von Richthofen's fleet, if you like, who were the original what's known as the Flying Circus. And his brother was in that picture. He himself, the Red Baron, was standing on the wing of the aeroplane, I believe, so he's out of shot. But the original people there, before they were altered, edited with different faces dropped in, were those original German fighter pilots. And obviously the 4 band members are in there, along with some other people as well, one of whom is the actress Glynis Johns, and that is a direct dig at Glyn Johns. Glyn Johns worked on the first album, but fell out.
Oh, he had a falling out with Jimmy, huh?
That's right. A few things he said, "Oh, you can't do that, Jimmy." And then Jimmy said, "Yes, I can." Things like Backward Echo and stuff like that. He said, "You can't do that, Jimmy." "Yes, I can." And he proved that he could. And they kind of fell out a bit. And Jimmy said, "Right, he's not working with us again." And one of those people they put in was the actress Glynis Johns, who was to deliberate poke at Glyn Johns. But one of the other things is they wanted to put Neil Armstrong on there. And one of the people there is supposed to be Neil Armstrong. But by mistake, they got the wrong picture and they used the wrong astronaut. I think it was a guy called Frank Borman, who was one of the earlier Apollo astronauts. And so it was supposed to be Neil Armstrong, but it wasn't. But they tried to rectify that later on Physical Graffiti by using one of the things that you see through the windows on the cover. When you look through the windows on the cover, one of them is a photo that's supposed to be of Neil Armstrong, so they could get it right. But unfortunately, they got it wrong again and used Buzz Aldrin.
Oh.
So Neil Armstrong he could have been on 2 Zeppelin album covers and failed to make either of them. Although technically, he is on the Physical Graffiti one because inside the visor of Buzz Aldrin's helmet, Neil Armstrong is taking the photograph. So
wow.
He's just about. So I think that's quite cool. Neil Armstrong missed the cut twice. But
the Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Time to check out some of the new and upcoming Books on Rock releases. A couple of must-read books released on December 28th. The first, Unchained, the Eddie Van Halen story by Paul Brannigan. That was released through Permuted Press. It's the first full-length biography of Eddie Van Halen, a searching, affectionate, and in-depth look at the remarkable life of a genuine musical virtuoso who changed the course of rock and roll. Acclaimed biographer Paul Brannigan tackles the dramatic story with respect and affection for one of rock's greatest musicians, pairing original interviews with meticulous research to bring the story of Eddie Van Halen completely up to date. And released through Black Dog and Leventhal Books, David Bowie All the Songs, The Story Behind Every Track by Benoit Claire. A lovingly thorough dissection of every album and every track ever released by David Bowie over the span of his nearly 50-year career. This book follows Bowie from his self-titled debut album, released in 1967, all the way through Black Star, his final album. This is a one-of-a-kind book drawing upon years of research in order to recount how each song was written, composed, and recorded, down to the instruments used and the people who played them, featuring hundreds of vivid photographs that celebrate one of music's most visually arresting performers. Some books being released soon, due out January 11th through Echo Books. Lightning Striking, 10 Transformative Moments in Rock and Roll by Lenny Kaye. An insider's take on the evolution and enduring legacy of the music that rocked the 20th century. Grandly sweeping and minutely detailed, informed by Lenny Kaye's acclaimed knowledge and experience as a working musician. Lightning Striking is an ear-opening insight into our shared musical and cultural history, a carpet ride of rock and roll's most influential movements and moments. And Dead Straight Guide to Queen by Phil Chapman, out on paperback January 11th through Red Planet. Few bands embodied the pure excess of the 70s like Queen. Theatrical, brilliant, even mercurial. There's never been another band like them, or a frontman like Freddie Mercury. This book tells the full story of the band and its members from pre-Queen to post-Freddie. For a list of all the newest and upcoming Books on Rock releases, head over to our website, bookedonrock.com. Led Zeppelin Every Album, Every Song by Steve Pilkington is out now, with a Whole Lot of Love being a top 10 single and that second album hitting number 1. The attendance numbers are starting to grow, and Led Zeppelin, they could have easily produced another Led Zeppelin 2 type of album, but this is where, in retrospect, the band is clearly saying, we are artists, we're not pop stars, we're not going to take a formula and repeat it. Robert and Jimmy, they take a holiday at a cottage in Wales, and they come up with the songs that make up the very folky acoustic Led Zeppelin 3, released in October of 1970. The track listing: Immigrant Song, Friends, Celebration Day, Since I've Been Loving You, Out on the Tiles, Gallows Pole, Tangerine, That's the Way, Bronyor Stomp, Hats Off to Roy Harper. Let's talk about that opening track, Immigrant Song. Now, I know a lot of people who have no interest in Led Zeppelin, or rock and roll for that matter, but love this song because they heard it in the Marvel movie Thor. The song inspired by a band trip to Iceland.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a week before they played, I think it was the Bath Festival. And because of their experiences that they had up there, which we'll go into a little bit more in the book, basically Plant came up with that lyric and they wrote that song. And only 7 days later, it was premiered live. So only 7 days after it was inspired, not even after it was written, it was actually played live. And then the very next day after that, recording started on it. So basically, between the inspiration for the song and the recording of it was 8 days, which is astonishing.
Unreal. My two favorite tracks from this album are back-to-back on side 2, Tangerine and That's the Way. So underrated and overlooked. Tangerine, you write, dates back to Jimmy's Yardbird days?
Yeah, basically going back to when Page was with the Yardbirds, they recorded Knowing That I'm Losing You. You can find that on YouTube. It was released later on in about 2017 on an album of sessions by the Yardbirds, but it was an instrumental on that for some reason. It didn't have Ralph's vocals on it. But if you find a version of that, it's fascinating to listen to because there's only 2 verses in it, of course, in Tangerine. But the second verse of the Zeppelin version of Tangerine is the first verse, almost verbatim, of the Yardbirds song. The chorus is totally different, but the music for the verses is the same. The first verse is the second verse of the Zeppelin song. And Page's iconic solo in that is almost note for note the same. But the guitar effects are much better on the Zeppelin version. It's a lot more basic on the Yardbirds one, but it is basically the same song. Now, there was a little bit of controversy about that because Jane Ralph started getting a little bit uppity about how Keith Ralph should have got a credit on it. But really, there's not too much to go on with that because even if Keith Ralph did write some of the words, the only words that he could have contributed was that one verse, basically like 3 lines, because the other verse in the Zeppelin version is completely new. So there's only about 3 lines there. And we know that Page wrote the music. And it has been claimed that Page wrote the lyrics about a romantic relationship with Jackie Shannon in the 60s. And it has been claimed that the lyrics were written about his relationship with her. So if that's the case, basically Ralph doesn't have a leg to stand on. It's really a he said, she said situation there. But Keith Ralph's contribution would be so small that it's not that significant. But it's very interesting to hear that Yardbird song because it is Tangerine with very few alterations.
The Led Zeppelin 3 album cover art is absolutely brilliant. And you write, if the second album, Getting a Gatefold, was a step forward, this is where all the stops were well and truly pulled out to create one of the most memorable album covers of the decade. Can you talk about this cover, what it is that we see here?
Oh, that's just amazing. I mean, the whole wheel with the thing, it's obviously the front cover has got all the cut-out holes, and there's a wheel mounted in there that you can turn around. And as you turn it round, different things appear in the windows, the band members' faces, other things. It was designed by a guy who went under the name of Zacron. He was a guy that Page knew from when they were students together at Kingston Polytechnic, I believe. At the time when Zep3 came out, he was lecturing at Leeds University, and the band did a gig at Leeds Uni, and they met up with him on that particular day and spoke to him about doing the album cover, which he did. A wheel like that inside something that turns round is known as a volvelle. That's the name of it. And the idea of it came, apparently, from an old crop rotation calendar where you would turn it round to see like the dates and what crops should be planted on that date or whatever. So that's where the idea came from. One of the photos in the book is of the wheel outside the cover, so you can see how it's just a psychedelic mass of things. But beyond the wheel, it's really random, some of the illustrations that are scattered around the cover. There's a lot of things that refer to flying. There's planes, there's zeppelins themselves, there's insects, there's dragonfly on there, I think there's a bird, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of totally incongruous things. There's a set of teeth, like a smile that's there for no apparent reason. On the inside cover, there's a guy in looks like a 19th century red military uniform with a big plumed hat, who is standing on top of a big thing that looks like a giant printing press. I've no idea what that is. I've dug in everywhere to see if there's a possibility that could have maybe been the original Count von Zeppelin. It could have been him, but it's not. That would have been nice, but it's not. I have no idea who that is or what that is, but it's a bizarre image. There's another image in there of a guy, again, one of the flying images. It's a guy who's got an umbrella up, and he seems to be flying like a Mary Poppins kind of thing with the umbrella. But in actual fact, he was sitting on a boat with the umbrella up, and Zakron took the picture, propped out the boat, and put him in there flying with the umbrella. So it's this really weird stuff going on there. If you look in, I think it's inside, there's a little old-fashioned car, like a sort of old gangster's Al Capone sort of car that's got JP in it for Jimmy Page. It's on the side of it. So there's so many random things to look at. It's fascinating.
And the album itself goes to number one. This was their second straight number one in the U.S. This was their first, I believe their first UK number one. I could be wrong. No, this was their second straight UK number one as well. So Zeppelin 2 and 3 go to number one in the UK, in the US. But here's what's crazy, and you write it in the book. Atlantic Records is saying, it's not considered a commercial success. That's crazy, but that's how they perceived Led Zeppelin 3. The bar was set very high.
That's it, and it's unbelievable that's could do better, but that was what they were faced with. It's interesting what you say about it ended up being the folky thing that it was, and the thing with recording at the cottage, which was Bronny Hour, of course, which means Golden Hill in Welsh, I believe. But the reason for decamping to that cottage was because they came back off the tour promoting Zep 2, and Ahmed Ertegun at Atlantic, he was absolutely driving them mercilessly. As soon as they came off that tour, he was, okay, when's the next album coming out? Come on. And they had to de-stress when they came off that tour. And Bonham and Jones went away and spent time with their families. They said, we are just not getting involved in it. We've got to have some time off to decompress. It's not happening. So they went off. So Plant and Page said, okay, we'll see what we can get together. So they went off to this cottage, which was owned by, it says in the book, I think it was one of Plant's relatives. And it was in a really inspiring part of Wales near Machynlleth, which it's near the ancient seat of Owain Glyndwr, who was a famous Welsh king. And Plant loves all those Celtic legends and those myths and everything. He really feeds from that. And he took a lot of inspiration from the location of the cottage. So they went in there with various recording people, and they went in with the families and that. But it wasn't exactly an idyllic cottage because it had no electricity or running water. So it was as basic as you could get. But they just basically went to the page, took a couple of acoustic guitars along, and they just started hammering out some of the ideas. And that's basically where the acoustic base for the album comes
I get
from.
that image in my mind of Page and Plant hanging out by a fire, writing some songs together.
Yeah, well, I mean, the original idea for the album was it was going to have an electric side and an acoustic side, like a rock side and acoustic. And the first side is supposed to be like the rock side of it, which it almost was, because you got Immigrant Song, Celebration Day, Since I've Been Loving You Out on the Tiles. In between those, you've got Friends, which is the only other track which doesn't quite fit into that mold. And obviously the second side, okay, Gallows Pole developed into a rock coda, but essentially the second side is very much more acoustic. But you mentioned before, That's the Way as well. Interestingly, on that one, the lyrics that are very much an idealistic hippie view of the world sort of thing. We all loved each other and everything. But one of the interesting things on that one is that while all four members played on that track, Jimmy Page actually played the bass on it, which was very unusual. That was simply because John Paul Jones had gone to bed and he wanted to do some overdubs, so he recorded the bass. John Paul Jones is on it, but he plays mandolin on that track, I think. and Bonham plays a bit of tambourine. But essentially, that's almost all Page and Plant. But one of the things that I put in the book is just so that the track will never sound the same again, is that Plant has offered up slightly too much information that about 30 minutes after they finished recording the track, Page's daughter Scarlett was conceived.
Wow.
So that's planted that image in your head. So
next time I listen to it, I'm thinking of that.
Yeah, half an hour after it.
Well, they deliver the masterpiece that is Led Zeppelin 4 next. We talked about Atlantic Records setting the bar high. Well, the band, as you write, they roll up their metaphorical sleeves and deliver a masterpiece that is Led Zeppelin 4. Released in November of 1971, hits number 2, goes on to sell 24 million copies. Is this Led Zeppelin at their peak?
Not quite, no. I think they had further to develop, which they did over the next 2 albums. Not that necessarily House of the Holy is a better album overall, but I think there are parts on there where they went beyond what they were doing on Zeppelin 4. So I don't think it was the band at their peak. I think they still had somewhere to go. But it's without doubt, it's a classic. And like you say about how it was like, you've got to do better than Zeppelin 3. That is the reason why Zeppelin 4 has no writing on the cover, no credit for who the band are, what the album was called, because they just basically reacted against us and said, okay, right, what we're going to do is we're going to make this sell on the music alone. And so we're going to have no name on the cover. And the bean counters at Atlantic just basically had a complete conniption fit over that. If you can't do that, it's commercial suicide. It wasn't.
And this is where we also get the symbols. This is, instead of the album title, they decide to choose their own symbols, especially Jimmy's symbol, known as Zoso, which is still a mystery.
Well, not exactly, no. Forget Zoso because it is not a word. You know, it's just coincidentally looks like the letter Z-O-S-O. It's actually a symbol which originally comes from around about the 16th century. Page was so into these old arcane occult tomes at the time. He bought an occult bookshop later on, and he was massively into this. But there was this particular symbol. It relates to Saturn, which is the planetary. I'm not big on my astrology, but it's the planetary sign of Capricorn. Saturn is Capricorn, and that was Page's own sun sign. So Saturn relates to Page's astrological sign, and that symbol refers to Saturn. And it originated in a 16th century book, which God knows how much that would cost. But then it got reprinted in, I think, the 19th century in a book called, translated as The Red Dragon, or whatever, which is an occult tome. And that's likely where Page found it. It's also been suggested by some people that the Zoso thing could be deliberate because Page's first guitar was a Grazioso. And they say, Zoso could be a tribute to that. But I don't buy that for a moment because that's far too earthbound an explanation for Page. So
now the symbols for the other guys, what do those symbols mean? I know the funny one is John Bonham. I think his symbol has something to do with a beer can or something, right?
Both his symbol and Jones's symbol were found in a book called The Book of Signs, which was a book that Page gave them to look through this and find your own symbols. So it was a book of old runes and things like that and symbols. So they picked them out. John Paul Jones one represents a powerful and confident person. So that reflected his sort of personality, if you like. But he just basically picked it out of the book. Bonham's one supposedly represents the Trinity, the Father, Son, Holy Ghost Trinity. That's the 3 symbols. Trefoil, I think it was they called it. But when they were touring for a while, they got to wherever it was in America, and they found that exact symbol was used as a logo for Ballantine beer.
Yes.
And say that he didn't know that all along. It really wouldn't surprise you, because he was fond of the odd pint of Bonham, as we know, tragically came back to bite him later. But that was the thing with his now plant symbol.
That's the feather, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that symbol comes from an ancient civilization called Mu, the Mu civilization, who were kind of like the Atlanteans. Mu was a mythical continent. And apparently the Mu civilization they were like an early form of the Atlanteans, where they were essentially the biggest power on Earth, but they were destroyed by the gods for their wanton behavior or whatever. So that symbol comes from an old book of Mu symbols. But it's also the feather that was also used in Egyptian symbology, because it's the feather from the scales of justice. The feather used to be weighed against the heart of the person to see whether they were just or not on the scales of justice, to judge them. And something really interesting about that, which I only discovered when I was researching the book, is that it specifically is an ostrich feather. And that, in fact, is the feather that used to be used on the balance in Egyptian mythology, because the ostrich feather is apparently the only bird feather in existence in nature which is symmetrical on both sides. All other bird feathers are curved slightly, and one side is slightly smaller than the other to give them the flight that they need, the aerodynamic effect. But the ostrich feather is symmetrical on both sides, and that's why it was used for the symbol of balance, which I think is really interesting.
Isn't that interesting? That's the thing about Led Zeppelin. They're so deep. There's a lot more there than many people even realize.
And that's it. And a lot of the time that sort of thing is more interesting to me than what guitar was Jimmy Page using on this track, or, what the equipment in the studio. That stuff is all interesting. But I think little things like that are really what makes the whole package of the band fascinating, everything around them.
Yeah, where did Robert come upon this? How does he discover it? That's what's fascinating, is you go deep into this, you go down that rabbit hole, and you may never come back out.
Yeah, that's literally what it was like writing this book, because there were times when I'd be 6 hours following trails down the deepest, darkest corners of the internet. It's amazing, one thing leads you onto another. It's a fascinating voyage of discovery. That's one of the great things about writing. Writing a book like this, I hope it's clear from reading the book, but because I've written quite a few of these on-track books now, I've done quite a few bands, and what I always do is I try to make it an entertaining read, put quite a bit of humour in it and stuff like that as well, because I think if you're just going to put a long list of facts, people can find out those facts nowadays in the information age, but it's got to be something that's interesting to read, entertaining to read, and then you pick up these facts while you're enjoying reading the book. That's what I try to put into it. And also I like to put my own opinions about things in, because I'm anticipating there'll probably be a few people will criticise this, because there are a certain subset of Zeppelin fans that are a bit like what I call the Beatle police, where if you claim that anything that the band put out is not touched by the breath of God, you're a heretic. But, I've never subscribed to that. I will never admit that Maxwell's Silver Hammer, Octopus's Garden are anything other than utter rubbish, for example, with the Beatles. And in the same way, I'm not going to put Hats Off to Roy Harper or Boogie with Stu on the same pedestal as Kashmir. You know what I mean? And I think when I read a book like this myself, I always find it interesting to see what the person writing the book thinks about this, because part of the fun for me is reading it and thinking, oh yeah, I agree with you, or what are you talking about? And shout at the page. So I try to put a bit of that in, and a bit of honest spice like that.
It is okay to not love everything about the band you love. It's no different than loving another person. Doesn't mean you have to love everything about them. There are going to be things you're going to say, I don't like when they do that. It drives me nuts when they do that. Or, there's nothing wrong with that. You could still be a fan. It's okay. I can respect everything that a band does. Don't have to like it all.
Yeah, I've been listening to music for 50 years, since I was 10 years old. And I can honestly say, hand on heart, as much as I love a lot of bands, and there's no band that I can say I like everything by. None. Because that's just the way it is. Every film somebody makes, an actor makes, is not great. There's always ups and downs, and it's the lesser things that put the greater things in a bigger relief. If everything's great, well, things can't stand out.
It is art, after all, and art is made by humans, so humans are not perfect. Yeah. And what's also really cool, though, is a lot of times there'll be a particular song, not just for Zeppelin, any band. I'll never like the song from day one, And I'll talk to somebody who say, that is my favorite song, and that means so much to me because I remember when I heard it. That's the other thing too, is when you heard a song for the first time, that connection you make to it.
Absolutely.
That's what's so fascinating. You'd say, how can you not love that song? I don't know. It just doesn't do it for me. Why? I don't know. I just don't feel anything when I hear it. Yeah. I remember when Santana's Smooth came out, and it was like the biggest hit single of all time. And I'm thinking, man, there's so many great Santana songs that I would have thought. I'd be terrible at a record label. I wouldn't be the guy to say that's going to be a hit single. I could never predict those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's get back to Zeppelin 4, the track listing here. Black Dog, Rock and Roll, The Battle of Evermore, Stairway to Heaven, Misty Mountain Hop, Four Sticks, Going to California, and When the Levee Breaks. Black Dog. This song is partly inspired by Howling Wolf, also partly inspired by Fleetwood Mac's Oh Well. Can you talk about this track?
Yeah, the Howling Wolf thing is a version of Smokestack Lightning that he recorded that had a very similar sort of riff, and that's apparently where the initial inspiration for the riff came from. I think it was an album called the Howling Wolf album. It was in the late 60s it came out, and that's supposedly where that came from. But the thing with Oh Well, the Fleetwood Mac thing, is it's the sort of a cappella vocal thing, where like in Oh Well, where the music stops, where the vocals will come in like, can't tell you about a shape of me, and I can't sing hey pretty on my legs up him, that kind of thing. And then the music comes in again, which is exactly the same as in Black Dog, where the music will stop and then you go, hey, mama, say the way you read. Then the music comes in again. So it's a very similar effect. And I believe that it was the intention to create that sort of effect with the song.
Yeah, as a tribute to the music that inspired them, which is like Rock and Roll, which comes from an off-the-cuff jam session. John Bonham having some fun with an old Little Richard song.
I Hear You Knocking, I think was the song. And if you listen to the original Little Richard recording of that, the drum break at the start of it is identical, absolutely identical to the start of Rock and Roll. And that's because he was playing that. So that's where he was playing that, and then the band just came in. They were actually trying to record Four Sticks at the time, but they really weren't going anywhere, and they took a break because they were getting a bit frustrated. Bonham started playing, he played that, and then Page came in with the riff, and magic started to happen. So I said, okay, Four Sticks gets shelved, let's work on this, and it just came together in no time.
That's that organic chemistry of those four guys together in a room. Jimmy picks up the guitar, starts playing, the rest of the guys come in, and you've got a song.
Black Dog as well, of course, the reason that Black Dog is called Black Dog, and the lyrics don't reference any dog or anything whatsoever, is simply because they didn't have a title for the song. And where they were recording at Headley Grange, there was a dog that hung around outside. It was a black dog. And basically, it used to hang around and sleep there outside every day. And then at night, it would go off. They didn't know what it was doing, but it came back in the morning exhausted and would sleep again. So they're saying, right, okay, that dog's going off at night doing whatever it does, being a bit of a dog, and coming back and then sleeping. So they called the song Black Dog because of what the dog was presumably getting up to.
Yeah, he was having some fun. Headley Grange is fascinating to me, too. Is Headley Grange does that still stand?
I believe so.
Yeah. Supposedly haunted, which was just the kind of place for Jimmy Page. Yeah, this is where they recorded this album. Bad Company records their debut there, too, I believe. And,
that's right.
And that's where Paul Rogers, under the moonlight, he says, out on the lawn outside of Headley Grange, they record the track Bad Company. I think that was the track. This place fascinates me. I would love to be able to go there.
Yeah, I have a little bit of fun in the book about that. I keep going back to that as a recurring sort of thing with Jimmy Page. I'll be with the ghosts. I mean, he loved the ghosts. Everybody else hated it because the place was damp and cold and haunted, and Page loved this and the rest of them. But this is how we hate this bloody place. I do have a little bit of fun with that, but they certainly got some fantastic results there. I mean, the drum sound on When the Levee Breaks, the most sampled drum sound ever. That really came about as a serendipitous accident because they tried recording the songs in every single room in the house because Headley Grange is like a big manor house, if you like. And they tried recording the drums everywhere and it wasn't quite working. But Bonham actually took delivery of another drum kit. The drum kit he had at the time was his Ludwig Green Sparkle kit. And he took delivery of another one that was basically the same. And it got deposited in the entrance hall, and when they took a break from recording, he thought, I'm going to try out this new kit, which had been set up in the entrance hall. So we went and started playing. They heard the sound with the natural echo of the big staircase that was going up above it. And that's the sound. And so Andy Johns hung a couple of microphones over the second floor staircase balcony. And the natural echo of the echo chamber that the big entrance hall is what you hear. It was treated a bit as well, but essentially that's it. It's only because if he hadn't had that drum kit delivered and hadn't sat there and just, let's try this out, they would never have thought of recording the drums in the hallway like that.
Yeah, it's so cool.
I don't class When the Levee Breaks as anything like the greatest Zeppelin song, because I find it I have described it a little bit uncharitably once or twice as a great drum sound in search of a song. That's a little bit harsh, but I don't think that song will be anything like what it is if it wasn't for that drum sound. It entirely makes the track.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Stairway to Heaven. You write about this saying, it's hard to know where to start with this one. Claiming to have a full understanding of this song is far more difficult, if not impossible. But you say in general terms, it's some kind of allegory relating to a materialist society in which anything, even a path to heaven, can be bought. What's below the surface? You write, there's so much below the surface, which is argued about, that going into them all would involve a book so heavy you could put your back out, getting it off the shelf. And you would go on to write about a few of the claims. So what are some of the claims?
Well, it's been claimed to be a religious thing by both sides of the religious divide. People who are a certain religious persuasion reckon that it's up there. For example, it's supposed to be about Our Lady, about Mary, because the lady in the song that they reckon is Mary, and the fact that she's the May Queen comes from May being the month dedicated to Mary and that sort of thing. So there's claims of that. There's the people on the other side, the occultists, who they reckon that the piper that's referred to is in fact Satan, for a reason that I have no idea where that comes from. And there's a hilarious backward message thing in it, where famously you can play a part of it backwards and it starts saying, "Here's to my sweet Satan." But in fact, it goes on beyond that, and it's claimed that it's this long thing about Satan who does this, does that, and it finishes up by saying he has a small tool shed. And so they're supposed to have put a backward message in about not only about Satan, but how he spends his time in the shed, which seems a little bit unlikely. And I mean, I tend to regard both of those religious sides, as more or less twaddle. Certainly the allegorical thing is beyond doubt, but there's also a lot of the Tolkien influence in there, because that's something that Plant has got form for. Of course, the Battle of Evermore just before it is entirely taken from Lord of the Rings, the Battle of the Five Armies. So we know how interested he is in that whole thing. And there's things in Stories of Heaven which are, I think, incontrovertibly taken from that, like those who stand long and the long-lived elves. There's a feeling I get when I look to the west. My spirit is crying for leaving. That's the elves who famously went across the sea to Valinor, the promised land, if you like, to where the port of Avalon was. And of course, in the Battle of Evermore, it mentions, "I'm waiting for the angels of Avalon." So that's mentioned in there. And also there are two paths you can go by, the splitting of the fellowship, all that kind of thing. And there are so many things in the Lady Shines White Light, Galadriel with the File of Light. There's so many things in there that I don't believe, like some people do, that the whole thing is about Lord of the Rings or whatever. It's not as simplistic as that. What I do think is that Plant had this idea of the general sort of allegory that he was trying to make, and he used a lot of Tolkien-esque imagery to get the point across. That's personally what I believe.
I think the smartest thing for any artist to do is to never reveal the meaning of the lyrics, because that keeps us guessing for years and years and years.
Certainly does. It's a brilliant lyric as well. It's a brilliant lyric.
By the way,
it's got to be said.
The tool shed, this is what it supposedly says when you play it backwards. Yeah. There was a little tool shed where he made us suffer, sad Satan.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, if you're buying that, fine, but nope.
Do you buy into any of the backwards masking theories, other than, of course, ELO, who intentionally did it? And I can't remember which album they did it. That's funny.
Well, were bands have intended it, yeah, but other things, like if you remember the Judas Priest case, Better By You, Better Than Me, where they claimed that they was telling the guys to commit suicide.
That's
backwards.
where it gets serious. That's where these guys take it real personal.
The brilliant thing in there, if you've ever seen the footage of Rob Halford in the witness stand, he plays something backwards from one of their songs. He said, now, if you play this one backwards, you'll find that it will say, I wanted a peppermint, I asked her to buy one. Yeah. And then he plays this backwards. And it sounds like, I wanted a peppermint, I asked her to buy one. And that just blew the whole thing apart. It showed how ridiculous it was.
Oh yeah, the attorney who's accusing him is sitting there with the jaw drop, like, I don't know I don't know how to respond to that. Yeah, but
it's brilliant.
Who was the first person to literally put an album on the turntable, spin it backwards, and listen to it? That's even more bizarre. Is somebody stoned out, somebody who was smoking something real good one night decided to, let's just play this backwards and see what happens.
Have you ever tried to play a vinyl record backwards and spin it at exactly 33 1/3 the wrong way?
Not easy. Not easy. Insane. Yeah, the artist to get pretty pissed off, man. Don Henley with the whole Hotel California thing. He was really, and he's not a guy with a sense of humor. He wasn't going to take that lightly.
These are the people, like I said in the book, these are the people that like to listen to the music with tinfoil hats on, so that's fine. Let them have it.
Yeah. You include in the book a mind-boggling statistic on Stairway to Heaven. If every play of the song on the radio worldwide since its release was played sequentially back-to-back, 24 hours a day, it would play for almost 44 years. That says it all.
I can't remember, but this is what I say about going down the rabbit hole when you start. I found this where it astonished me that there are people who actually do add these things up and do the maths. And it's incredible, but there are people who turn up about these sort of things to add them up. And thankfully, there's somebody who did that. That gave me a great fact. I can't imagine the people who do that, but it's apparently true.
Steve Pilkington's Led Zeppelin, Every Album, Every Song is out now. Zeppelin returns with Houses of the Holy, March 1973, another #1, both in the UK and US. The song remains the same. The Rain Song, Over the Hills and Far Away. The Crunge, Dancing Days, Jamaica, No Quarter, and The Ocean. Over the Hills and Far Away, there is a bit of Jimmy's Yardbird days again.
Yeah, the acoustic intro to that song is very reminiscent of White Summer, which was a piece that Page recorded with the Yardbirds. I think it was on the album at the Games. And he also used to play it together with Black Mountainside in early Zeppelin performances. And he definitely used a little bit of his own inspiration there for that one.
Jamaica, you write that the title is a joke that got widely misunderstood. Can you talk about the title, which, by the way, is spelled D''YERMAKER, pronounced Jamaica? Where did this come from?
Yeah, MAK''ER again. That's from a joke which basically, back in the 70s, every schoolboy in the UK knew this joke, which was just simply, my wife went on holiday to the Caribbean. Jamaica? No, she went of her own accord. Right? So it's a poor joke. But basically, that's where that came from. The band knew the joke, and they just assumed, because everybody in the UK knew that schoolboy joke, they kind of assumed everybody in the world would get that. Far from it, because when it came out in the US, people were referring to it as Diamaker. Diamaka was another one, and Plant, he had to explain it in an interview once, and he said, I can't believe I'm having to explain this, but it's Jamaica. It's from that wordplay of the country Jamaica and Jamaica. But that's where that comes from. They must have thought, why did we do that? It's given us so much grief.
No Quarter is my personal pick from this album. It's dark, it's mysterious, the music fits the lyrics perfectly.
I'll actually tell you something about that I didn't actually put in the book, but as a personal thing, No Quarter was the first Zeppelin song I ever heard.
When did you first hear it? What's the story behind this?
When Houses of the Holy came out in 1973, I was 12, and I was watching the Old Grey Whistle Test. basically the only rock show that we had over here on BBC Two. And when How's the Holy came out, what they used to do when an album came out, before the days of having videos that were made to go with songs, they used to play a song and they put old cartoon footage or silent film footage with it. They played No Quarter, and they played some sort of, I think it was some kind of horror film, silent horror film thing behind it with all rolling mist and all this kind of thing.
Perfect.
And they played the song, and I was watching that, and here's a track from the new Led Zeppelin, How's the Holy Feathers. I'm like, what is this? I was 12 and it just blew my mind. That was my introduction to Zeppelin, was No Quarter.
It's crazy you say that because I picture an old black and white movie with the Dogs of Doom howling. It's like an old Sherlock Holmes type of film. John Paul Jones plays the electric piano, feeds it through what is believed to have been a VCS3 synthesizer, which, as you point out in the book, was made famous by Pink Floyd on Dark Side of the Moon soon afterwards. Yeah. That gives it that eerie sound. The opening lyrics: close the door, put out the light, no, they won't be home tonight. The snow falls hard, and don't you know, the winds of Thor are blowing cold.
It's so evocative, the imagery, that it's incredible. It could mean anything you want it to be. Those, all this they carry news that must get through. They could be anything. It could be a Norse thing. It could be a fantasy thing. It could be, like you say, Sherlock Holmes thing. It could be anything that you see it in your mind. But the imagery is just incredible. And like in the chorus, goes, they ask no quarter, meaning no mercy. And you think, no, for what? Why are they asking for no mercy? And it's another thing where everybody can make their own story out of it. You can make your own movie in your head from those lyrics. It's brilliant. It's so concise, but it's one of the greatest Zeppelin lyrics for me. There isn't a line wasted. There isn't a word wasted. It's everything's just on the money. It's a little bit like, in my mind, when Dylan wrote Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, he said the way he wrote that was every line in it was a jumping off point for a different song for him. Every line was a different image. He said it was like a dozen songs concentrated into 12 lines. No Quarter is a bit like that. There's nothing wasted. There's no fat.
The band follows Houses of the Holy with Physical Graffiti, February of 1975. This is the double album with 15 tracks. Custard Pie, The Rover, In My Time of Dying, Houses of the Holy, Trampled Underfoot, Kashmir, In the Light. Okay, help me with this one now, Steve. So, Bron-Yr, what's Bron-Yr and what is it?
Bron-Yr.
Bron-Yr. Okay, now this one has an R in it, so this is Bron-Yr. The other track is spelling. Okay.
Bron-Yr was from Led Zeppelin 3. That is a misspelling. The YR is the correct spelling.
Okay, so this one is the correct spelling. BronYraur, and Bron-Yr Stomp on Zeppelin 3 spelled incorrectly. Bronyaur. Okay. And then we have Down by the Seaside, 10 Years Gone, Night Flight, The Wanton Song, Boogie with Stu, Black Country Woman, and Sick Again. You write, Physical Graffiti may have ended up rightfully becoming a legendary release, but it was, like so many other classics, born out of a period of upheaval and uncertainty, with the 16 months or so before its eventual release in February 1975 being some of the most unsettled and turbulent in the band's career. Can you expand on that some more?
Well, absolutely. I mean, basically, the band almost ceased to exist when John Paul Jones actually left the band for a while, but it was pushed up. After the tour in 73, promoting How's the Holy, which climaxed with the footage for the song Remains the Same, that tour was just like a byword for rock excess. They were breaking attendance records every night, and they were flying in the Starship, and there was the rock and roll madness that was surrounding them. They were, by the end of the tour, they were getting death threats. All the band and Peter Grant as well, they were getting death threats from people. It was just getting so heavy, and they had a ring of steel around them with the security and that. It had gone beyond, And when they came back off that tour, basically, John Paul Jones, who was very much, as Peter Grant said, he was a family man. And he was having a lot of trouble being in this world, this goldfish bowl, and being away from his family. And he'd had enough. And he went to Peter Grant and he said, I've had it, I'm leaving. I can't do this anymore. Obviously, that would have been a catastrophic blow at that point for the band. Peter Grant, to his credit, because, there's a lot of things that Peter Grant got wrong. There's stories about Peter Grant are nearly as legion as stories about Zeppelin. Is the heavy-handed tactics and that kind of thing. But Zeppelin wouldn't have had the career they did without Peter Grant, because everything he did was for the good of the band, and it almost always worked.
And he was their manager from day one.
Yeah. There's quite a few interesting stories about him in the book, which we can't go into now. But yeah, if you do get the book, a lot of interesting stuff about Grant. But in this case, he basically talked him down a bit. But to his credit, he didn't try to bully him into it and say, there's no way you're leaving. If you're leaving, then there's going to be trouble. He said, I understand you, and I know where you're coming from. It's got too heavy. You've got to do what you've got to do. But he said, just promise me one thing. He said, don't mention it now. Wait until in the new year, because this was like in the autumn of 73. He said, just wait till the new year, and then if you still feel the same, we'll make the announcement. They fed a story at the time where he was just taking a bit of a break, or he was ill, or he was suffering from exhaustion, that kind of thing. But rumours started to leak out and that sort of thing, because he played on a couple of other albums by other people, and rumours came out that, as he left Zeppelin. But as it happened, when it came into the new year, Grant's tactic paid off perfectly, because he reconsidered it and he said, okay, I'm going to stick with it. I can't throw this away. Like Grant said, it was never spoken of again. But they were that close behind the scenes to just falling apart and Zeppelin finishing at that point. And I believe that is why Bad Company came to record their album at Headley Grange, because Zeppelin had to pull out of the recording because Jones wasn't there. They were doing a bit of work with the three of them, but not much. So they scrapped their sessions. And so the time was available there at Headley Grange, and Bad Company stepped in. And they were also signed to Swan Song Records, which was the other thing that was happening at that time, where they wanted to set up their own label, because Peter Grant was unhappy about some of the things that Atlantic were doing, and there was various things. And there was protracted negotiations and figuring out the distribution deal that they were going to have with Atlantic for distributing things on their own label and that kind of thing, and what the financial structure was going to be. Those negotiations went on for so long, then they couldn't decide what the name of the label was going to be. It was going to be Slag Records and then Slut Records, which would have been terrible. It was also going to be Eclipse Records for a while, various things, until eventually they came up with Swan Song after a piece that they had recorded but never finished, which is another story. But that went on for so long. So after the thing with Jones, the band almost falling apart, and then the whole Swan Song saga delayed recording sessions again. And then when they got the 8 new tracks that they recorded for Physical Graffiti down, they put it together, of course, with the double album by reworking songs from the past that they had lying around, and they finished them off and used them. But then there was delays with the cover art because it was so complex with the cutout windows and the inserts and all that. So the album was delayed into the next year. So everything from 73 to early 75 when that album came out was one drama after another behind the scenes.
And Steve, I see you're wearing your Physical Graffiti shirt, that famous album cover.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
That's an actual location in New York.
It certainly is, yeah. It's in St. Mark's Place, near St. Mark's Church. It's a tenement building, which is actually a 5-story building, but that makes it too rectangular. And in order to fit on the square album cover, they had to crop out the 4th story of the 5, which was a little bit harder back then before you had Photoshop and stuff like that. So it's an invisible crop, but in the book there is a photo of the actual building itself, and you can see all the 5 stories.
A few standout tracks let's get to from Physical Graffiti, starting with the big one, Cashmere, often quoted by Robert Plant as being his favorite Zeppelin song, but we're going to get into some other songs that he's recently said he loves. How did this monster of a track come into being? It starts with a drive along a very lengthy single-track road through the desert in Morocco that went on seemingly forever. I'll let you take it from there, Steve. What's the rest of this story?
Yeah, well, basically, I mean, first of all, I'd like to say I agree with Robert on that one. That Kashmir, to me, is the apex of Zeppelin. Doesn't get better than that. But yeah, he was driving in Morocco, and it was this long, straight road, and he said that he got this image in his mind of it going all the way to Kashmir without ever turning off. Kashmir, of course, is disputed territory on the border of India and Pakistan. different parts of the country are under the control of India, Pakistan, and China. It's got a reputation of being kind of a place of peace and magic and tranquility and Hindu sort of philosophy. That was enshrined in a famous poem, which is, I've gone to it in the book, which from the 19th century. But it's a very evocative place, Kashmir, and the whole thing around it. If you go there, it's probably not that evocative at all. But it's in Robert Plant's mind, the whole lyrics, Shangri-La beneath the sun and moon and all that, he's digging into that image of Kashmir as being almost like a heaven on earth place. He said that the original title was Driving to Kashmir because he thought of that road as being driving all the way to Kashmir. And that image in his head of how I'm on this road almost forever until I get to this place really put the whole image into his mind.
Another standout song is Trampled Underfoot. This was released as a single in several countries. You write that it shares significant DNA with Stevie Wonder, specifically Superstition.
Yeah, that whole funky beat and the use of the clavinet, which Stevie Wonder used to use a lot to get the funk in his rock funk things that he was doing at the time, the rock funk hybrids like Superstition and stuff like that. It's got very much that sort of feel to it. And interestingly, it's also got a clavinet solo in it, which is unusual for a Zeppelin song. But the interesting thing with Trampled Underfoot is when you try to listen to the words, you realise that it's very hard to pick out what Plant's actually singing. The words are very much buried low in the mix. There's probably good reason for that, because if you actually read the words, like I've quoted some of them in the book, it's a whole list of sexual innuendos and double entendres couched in the language of a car, checking your transmission under the hood and all this kind of thing. It's basically, it's not subtle. And I think it's my personal belief, although I've never had this correlated, but I think they deliberately mixed it down so that the voice sounds like another instrument on the track. You could listen to Trampled Underfoot 50 times, and somebody said, oh, so what's he singing about? You think, oh, now what? And you can only think of a few words that crop up. I think they did that deliberately to use the voice as an instrument, because I think it would have taken you out of the groove of the song.
Interesting way to look at it. It's speaking of that groove, Bonzo with the bass pedal.
Yeah, it's incredible. But like I said in the book, basically, Bonzo had one job in that song, and that was to nail that rhythm down and keep it nailed down. And boy, does he do it. I said that in a decade or two in the future of that, bands would have used a drum machine. But like I said, Zeppelin had a drum machine. It had a beard, and its name was John Bonham, because that man was, there's metronomes that can't keep it. And it's a very clever song because it's a very repetitive riff, just with the 11 by another bit that'll come in, that'll go back to the riff again. And it could easily get tedious, but it doesn't. And the reason for that is if you listen to it, Page keeps putting little extra guitar bits in each time the riff gets repeated. So it never sounds quite the same in your mind, and it never gets repetitive. It's astonishing that it's driven for so long with that same repetitive riff. Personally, I feel like when listening to that it could go on for 2 hours and I wouldn't get tired of it. And that's an amazing thing to do with such a simple riff.
How many other bands can pull that off? I don't know if any other band can. Otherwise, it sounds paint by numbers if another band tries to do it.
Well, even Zeppelin couldn't pull it off on the album before because they tried it on the Crunch, and that is nothing like as effective.
Have you seen the bridge? Have you seen the bridge?
Bridge, yeah. But I mean, it's a nice funk sort of rhythm, but it doesn't really work. But then one album later, they do it again with Trampled Underfoot, and bang, totally nailed it. This is funk rock. Nailed it.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The next Zeppelin album is often overlooked, and that is Presence from March of 1976. Only 7 tracks: Achilles' Last Stand, For Your Life, Royal Orleans, Nobody's Fault But Mine, Candy Store Rock, Hot's On for Nowhere, and T for One. It did hit number 1, again, both the UK and US. The album cover features the mysterious obelisk-shaped object referred to in the inside sleeve as the object. What is this mysterious object? Because Robert has dropped a hint that it relates to a very famous film.
Yeah, he drops a hint relating to 2001. He drops a hint about Kubrick. The whole thing in 2001 where the bone is thrown up by the ape, that scene. So, yeah, there's definitely a Kubrickian thing there. But people have put forth lots of theories, like the fact that the object on the cover is, I mean, it's obviously this thing with the twist in the tower of it, but on the actual cover where it's put into the various photographs, you'll notice that it's actually just a complete black thing. It's not actually the object itself, it's just blackness in that shape. So it doesn't reflect any light, it doesn't cast a shadow, it's an emptiness, if you like. So that's the sort of thing that, you could, is it representing people's materialist ideals or something, the way they're fascinated by this? Because they're still sitting around and staring at it. What does it represent? There's all sorts of theories. But when it comes down to where the obelisk came from in the first place, I think I've postulated an idea there in the book. And there's actually one of the photos in the book, a 1956 drawing sketch by Salvador Dali called Compotier a Fruit, something like that. Basically, it's a still life sketch, and there's some fruit on it. In the bottom left corner of it, there is a thing which looks exactly like the object. So close that it couldn't be coincidence to me. It's a tower with a single twist in it, with a base, just like that. So I think that was taken directly from that Salvador Dali drawing.
And there's also some interesting Led Zeppelin trivia regarding the back cover and the photo.
Yes. On the back cover of the album, the photograph that's got the two school kids and the teacher, where the teacher is holding a hand on the object and a hand on the boy's head, as if she's kind of reading his mind. And the schoolgirl is standing next to her. The schoolgirl in that picture is the same girl who was the girl on the House of the Holy album cover, Samantha Gates.
Oh, one of the girls on the rocks.
Yeah. Yeah, it was the two people on the rocks were brother and sister, Stefan and Samantha Gates. And Samantha Gates is that same girl on the back of the present's sleeve 3 years later.
How about that? Now, Nobody's Fault But Mine. It's a popular track, but would you say the lead track, Achilles' Last Stand, is really the standout track from this album?
Oh, yeah. I think most people would probably say that, because even the people that don't like Presence, and there are a lot of it's a divisive album, but even the people that generally say they don't like Presence will often add, apart from Achilles, because it's like, oh, yeah, you've got Achilles, but is there anything? Because there's nothing else on the album that really sounds anything like as big as that. So the way that's put there at the front can make the rest of the album sound a little bit of anticlimax. I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people don't care for the album. Plus the fact it's so simply recorded. There's no keyboards on that album, which is so unusual for Zeppelin. There's no acoustic guitar on it, apart from a little bit on one track that's hardly audible. There's no acoustic guitar. It's a very basic album. It was recorded quickly, and of course, it was put together in the aftermath of Robert Plant's accident in Greece, where he was almost killed. His car accident, when his injuries were so bad, they thought he might lose his leg originally, and he recorded the vocals for that album in a wheelchair when they recorded the album in Munich. And at one point, he actually forgot himself and got up out of his wheelchair and rushed to hear a playback or something in his enthusiasm, put his weight on his leg, and as he said, he went down in a world of pain and flashing lights. He was rushed to hospital again, and it was touch and go to save his leg again because he redid it. So it was a very challenging recording process.
This really is a Jimmy album for the most part. He's the one who really spearheads the music on this album.
Achilles' Last Stand, all of the guitar overdubs on that, which there are so many, were done in a single day. Page just did the whole lot in a single day. It's incredible. And they were under such pressure to finish the recording because the Stones were to do recording there. And they managed to buy a couple of days off them. They took a couple more days off the Stones schedule. And so basically, Page and the producer were working together on shifts, basically 24 hours. If one would sleep for a bit, the other one would work. And over a 48-hour period of 24-hour day working like that, they just got the whole thing nailed. It's amazing it came out like it did.
And it is, like you say, it's an often forgotten album, or it's a divisive album. A lot of fans will say they don't like it. But this is interesting, and I sent you the link to this article last night. This is from Loudwire, where they quote Jason Bonham, who he said he recently spoke with Robert and was asking Robert about Zeppelin's music. He asked Robert, what was your favorite song? And he said, T for One, and he still loves Achilles' Last Stand. He said, if I ever play somebody something from Led Zeppelin, this is it. Listen to this. This is what we had. That's interesting, because Cashmere was the one he would go to a lot.
I think what he's saying there with Achilles is, in a way, that would define Zeppelin more than Kashmir, because Kashmir has a whole orchestral sound to it, and it's not quite typical. Achilles, it showcases Bonham's drumming incredibly. It showcases Page's guitar so well. So I think it does have everything in there. And also, I think one of the reasons that Plant chooses both of those songs is that they are the two songs on that album that have the most personal lyrics to him. Because T for One was a heartfelt song written about when he was missing his wife, when they were writing the songs for the album. It's a simple blues song, and basically it's just, this is how much I'm missing you. It was a very, very personal song for him. So I think that's probably a big reason why he loves that one. And Achilles as well is, while it's a very esoteric and difficult to fathom song, it's very, again, it can mean different things to different people, but there's a lot of parts of that lyric that are very much influenced by his accidents, where they're referring to the trip to Greece and that kind of thing. So I think lyrically, as much as anything, those are the reasons why those songs mean a lot to him.
The song remains the same. September of 76, they released this one. Taken from shows recorded in July of 73 at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Where do you rank this album when putting it up against some of the famous live albums like Frampton Comes Alive or Kiss Alive was big in the 70s? Where do you put this Song Remains the Same up with those?
I rank it very high, actually. I always loved Song Remains the Same. And I disagree with a lot of people, but I personally think Song Remains the Same is still a better live album than How the West Was Won. When that came out, a lot of people say, that's what Song Remains the Same should have been. To me, there's a magic in the grooves where at times the song remains the same, that it's indefinable. In the version of No Quarter, the version of The Song Remains the Same going into Rain Song, which is incredible. There's something about that sound there that's just Zeppelin's indefinable best. There's just a magic there that they've managed to bottle, lightning in a bottle for me. Although I will say that the track selection on the original vinyl album was just baffling, because whoever came up with the decision to include a 12-minute Moby Dick and to leave out Since I've Been Loving You is absolutely astonishing. Moby Dick in the film is interesting to watch, because watching John Bonham is always interesting when he's doing a solo, and also it's got his fantasy sequence in it as well. So that works. On the album, less so. It's like listening to paint dry, I would say. So why they chose to put a 12-minute drum solo instead of an incredible version of Since I've Been Loving You is bizarre. And of course, they missed off Black Dog from the album as well. They put Celebration Day on the album, but they missed that out from the original film as well, which is strange. But another interesting thing is that, going back to the Orgreave Whistle Test again, when the film came out, they used Black Dog as the trailer clip. Black Dog was the version that was released, that they played on the Whistle Test and other things like that. That was a song they released. And then they released the soundtrack and missed out off that song, which is baffling. That, of course, has all been rectified with the expanded edition in recent times. It's got the whole of the show. It's got Heartbreaker in there, it's got Black Dog in there, it's got Since I've Been Loving You. And I think having that whole thing now, to me, that is the definitive, officially released live Zeppelin. That's another thing that it's hard to communicate to people today, because when that came out, of course, it was before the days of home video and all that sort of thing. And I remember going to see that when I was 15 at the time, and I went to the cinema to watch it. It was packed out. The town where I grew up, St Helens, northwest of England, and there was just one cinema in the town. And basically, that was on for 2 weeks. So for 2 weeks, the only film you could see in the cinema in the town was Zeppelin. It was full every night. And I remember about a year later, a local film club showed it. There was a midnight showing at the town hall. And I went down for that, and it was standing room only in there. Oh, another chance to see The Song Remains the Same. If you could possibly see it, you'd go anywhere to watch it. Because now you can just, again, get it up at the click of a mouse. But it was such a big thing. And you've got to remember that at that time, they hadn't played outside London for over 3 years. I think 4 years. So people elsewhere in England have probably never seen Zeppelin, younger fans.
Did you ever get a chance to see Led Zeppelin live?
I did not, and there's a story behind that. Yeah, I was a bit too young to get down to Earl's Court for those shows. I was only 14, and they never played the UK again until the Nebworth shows. And when the Nebworth shows were announced, I was going on a family holiday. We were going on holiday on the date of the first show, and we were coming back on the date of the second. So we were travelling both days. So looking back in retrospective now, I should have binned off the entire holiday and said no Zeppelin, but I thought, I'll catch them next time. And of course, there was never a next time. And I remember on this Sunday, I was in a chip shop. It was in North Wales that we were on holiday. And this guy came in to the shop there. He had a Zeppelin T-shirt. I said, did you go down to Nebworth? It was incredible. He was telling me about it. And I was, oh my God, I'll catch him next time. And of course, there never was a next time. John Bonham died. And I think I put on the acknowledgements dedicating it to that guy. So, hey, I hate you, but...
You were there.
I saw Page and Plant in the 90s. I tried to get a ticket for the O2 show in 07, but like the other 250,000 people, I was unsuccessful. So Page and Plant is the closest I got, sadly.
Led Zeppelin's final studio album before John Bonham's passing was In Through the Outdoor, released in August of 1979. Yeah. 7 tracks: In the Evening, Southbound Soiree, Fool in the Rain, Hot Dog, Carousel Alhambra, All My Love, and I'm Gonna Crawl. The use of synthesizers is evident here, and I think this is a sign of where the band was heading in the 80s.
Well, yeah, the reason for the use of that synth is because, basically, Jimmy Page just wasn't anything like as invested in the making of that album at the time for one reason or another. And John Paul Jones and Robert Plant are the main writing team. And Jones had acquired a synth called the Yamaha GX1. It was massively expensive. It was about 50,000 quid for one at the time. The album was recorded at ABBA's studio, Polar Studio in Sweden. And at the time, apparently, there were only 3 privately owned Yamaha GX1 machines in the world, one of which was owned by Benny Andersson from ABBA, one of which was John Paul Jones, and the other one was Stevie Wonder. And he uses that throughout the album. That's what creates the range of orchestral sounds and stuff like that. It was like Mellotron, synth built in, everything. Amazing machine. And that is very much the sound of the album.
2 big singles from this, Fool in the Rain and All My Love. Fool in the Rain, you write, shouldn't have worked, but did. In fact, it's irresistible.
Yeah, it really shouldn't, because it's got that midsection, which is like a samba thing. And it's like, this should be terrible, but somehow it is irresistible. It's terrible in a way, but you can't help but love it. For the longest time, I hated it, incidentally. When I was young, when I first heard the album, I thought it was terrible. But now, I love it, which often happens as you get older. The only song that I think on the album that I still think is really poor and fails on every level is Hot Dog.
Yeah.
You've got to call it like you see it sometimes, and that's terrible. But All of My Love is an interesting one because I love that song. It's written about Robert Plant's son, Karak, of course, who died while they were on tour in the US.
Stomach virus?
Stomach virus. They thought it was just a bit of a virus, went into hospital, and he got the phone call saying he died, which that threw all the cards up in the air for so long. And that's a heartfelt tribute to him, and I think it works brilliantly. And I really take exception in the book to what Jimmy Page was saying. He criticised that song. He said it was all right for what it was, but it was too poppy, and I don't think I could see ourselves going down that road, so I wasn't convinced by it. And I said, look, the thing is, Jimmy, you're happy to do reggae, you're happy to do country, you're happy to do rockabilly till the cows come home, you're happy to put samba in, but a song like All My Love, that's too far? Come on.
Yeah, and you got a song, Hot Dog, on the album. I think you may want to talk about that one in a negative light, not this one.
That's okay, but all my love, we couldn't go down that path. Well, no, but I mean, it's not a departure like some of the other things we've done.
Maybe he was saying that because the song was such a hit and the fans were thinking it was too poppy, so he felt he needed to apologize. Like, hey, we haven't sold out.
Maybe because it was very much Planton Jones's song and he didn't have the creative input to it.
Yeah, that's possible too. John Bonham sadly died in 1980 at the age of 32. The band would cease to exist. Robert Plant would say it again and again, no Bonzo, no Led Zeppelin, and he's stayed true to that. But they did put out one more album, a collection of unused tracks from various sessions, and it was called Coda. That came out in November of 82. 8 tracks: We're Gonna Groove, Poor Tom, I Can't Quit You Baby Live, Walter's Walk, Ozone Baby, Darlene, Bonzo's Montreux, and Wearing and Tearing. What's your personal pick from this album?
It's hard to make a pick from the album because I think the album's a complete mess, to be honest. It was a massive wasted opportunity. When it later came out as a 3-disc edition, it had lots of really interesting outtakes from the band's career, which would have made it much better at the time. But I think the ones that they used, for a start, it was only about 32 minutes long, far too short. And some of the tracks that they used were just not interesting enough for me. But strangely enough, if I was going to pick one track, I'd probably pick the drum solo, Bonzo's Montreux, because that was like Bonham's idea about doing a sort of a drum orchestra, if you like. And I think the way he did that really works. I think it's the only thing on the album that's got something different about it. All the other things sound like outtakes that weren't good enough for another album.
What is your favorite Led Zeppelin album?
Physical Graffiti. Not only does it have some of my very favourite Zeppelin tracks on it, but the breadth of material on it covers all of the Zeppelin bases in one. And the only track that I would say really is entirely disposable is Boogie with Stu, which was probably fun to record, but not very much fun to listen to. But the rest of the album is just right across the board, from heavy rock to epic rock to country to acoustic guitar. It's marvellously done. It's brilliant. And I just think there's a magic about that album that beats any of the others. How's the Whole great, but it's let down by Jamaica and Crunge a little bit. Zepp 4 will probably be my second favourite, and I think I'd put Zepp 3 in just behind that. And then probably How's the Holy just behind that for consistency. Zeppelin 2, I would rank quite low, actually. Zeppelin 2 for me has got brilliant material, but it's let down by some weaker material. I've never been too keen on the Lemon Song, to be brutally honest with you.
Okay, that's where we disagree. This might be the first place we disagree. I love the Lemon Song.
Well, to me, it doesn't sustain its length. Moby Dick is, well, it's a drum solo, not a particularly good one. And I'm not too convinced by Bring It On Home at the end of the album either. So I think that's a little bit too much filler to make it a truly great album.
I would put Zeppelin 3, 1, Zeppelin 2 at number 2. Zeppelin's debut at, no, I'd have to put 4 behind that. Then Zeppelin, then Physical Graffiti, then Houses of the Holy, then Presence, then In Through the Outdoor.
Right. So I would say Zeppelin 2 is the most overrated Zeppelin album, and In Through the Outdoor is the most underrated.
Where do you think Led Zeppelin would have gone musically if John Bonham lived? The 80s, 90s, 2000s?
It's hard to say because apparently Bonham and Page were tossing over ideas for a follow-up album to In Through the Outdoor when he died, and it was going to be a return to a lot more guitar rock. So it's possible we might have got a really interesting album out of that. Beyond that, it's hard to predict where they would go because at the time of Zepp 3, how would you then predict that you'd get House of the Holy 2 years down the line? You can never predict what Zeppelin are going to do next.
Led Zeppelin, every album, every song. It's out now through Sonic Bond Publishing. It is available wherever books are sold. The Burning Shed website, the best place for people to go to get a copy?
It is for me because my share of the royalty is far better on that than it is on Amazon.
Okay.
It's not very big.
We're going there then.
But by the same token, if you're buying it from the US, your postage is going to cost more than Burning Shed because they're UK-based. So in all fairness, I can only tell people in the US to get it from Amazon US because that's where you'll get it cheapest.
Okay. And social media pages?
People can find me on social media. They can find me on Facebook. I'm easy to find. Just put in the name and you'll find me. And just quickly, the other books that I've written, doing a search in Amazon on my name will find all the books that I've written. But I've done similar song-by-song books on Black Sabbath, Rolling Stones, Iron Maiden, Deep Purple and Rainbow. I've also done a biography of Uriah Heep in the 70s. I've done the official biography of Gordon Giltrap. And I've also done a complete guide to Monty Python. So you can find all of those things.
All right, Steve, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Absolutely. Cheers. Good to talk.
Thanks to Steve Pilkington for taking us through his book, Led Zeppelin, Every Album, Every Song. You can read more of Steve's work at the Velvet Thunder website. That's velvetthunder.co.uk. You'll find interviews, reviews, live reviews, news of classic rock, prog, and metal. I'll link to the website on our show notes page. And if you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Steve, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore on our website, bookedonrock.com. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast and on Twitter at bookedonrock. Our email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks as always for listening, and join me again next time for another episode of Booked on Rock.